Today we are going to talk about Catford's translation shifts, which were done in the 60s. In 1965, that was the first time that article by Catford was actually being used and being talked about. Now, what is so special about these shifts is that when do we use them actually? We use them only when it is impossible to match the formal equivalence in translation. As you know, the formal equivalence is relating to the actual structure and content or meaning of the sentence. So when you cannot match the actual formal equivalence, you are bound to, as a translator, to go for what's called translation shifts. And these translation shifts are extremely useful when it is impossible to match the actual structure or class or unit of translation. And that is when you use them, actually, these shifts. Now, what are shifts in translation? According to Catford in 1965, he's saying that they are the departure or departures from formal equivalence in the translation process, from the S.r.l. to the T.l. So when you are departing from the formal equivalence, the exact equivalence, if you like, in terms of linguistic equivalence between the two languages, the S.r.l. source language and the T.l. the target language, if you cannot match it correspondingly, then you have to move on and use what's called translation shifts. And here, of course, the focus, I have to say that in the 60s, in 1960s, the focus was on equivalence and linguistics and translation. And we're not talking here about cultural equivalence in particular, because cultural equivalence was used to an extent by Nida when he was talking about the formal equivalence late in the late 60s. And of course, Nida later on, he has actually said that when you are translating, that language is part of culture, and therefore you have to be, as a translator, bilingual and bicultural. But let me just now not go into that, because that's quite a lot of maybe I could cover that in some other session about culture and translation. Lefebvre and Suzanne Basnet, and quite a few others in culture studies and translation, or culture and translation, like Venuti, for example, where they talk about the ideology and patronage and other elements and components of culture and translation. But here the main concern is with regards to translation shifts, and we are talking about translation shifts. And as I said, I'm just going to repeat that, these shifts in translation are departures. According to exact words of Catford in 1965, he says they are departures from formal equivalence in the translation process from the S.r.l. to the T.l. Now, there are main two types of shifts that occur. One of them, one main type, is level shifts, and the other one is category shifts. The level shifts, of course, is moving from an item, an S.r.l. item, from one linguistic level to a T.l. translation equivalent at a different linguistic level, i.e. the linguistic level is going to change when you are translating that item from the S.r.l. to the T.l. And as I said earlier, why do we go for shifts? Is because there is an impossibility of getting the right similar corresponding structure or corresponding unit or corresponding grammar or corresponding class I'm just going to show you some of the few points to raise in this. Of course, as you can see, that is the idea of the shifts in translation according to Catford are departures from formal equivalence in translation, in the translation process, from the S.r.l. to the T.l. And the two major types or kinds are level shifts and category shifts. The level shifts, as I said, it's moving from one linguistic level in the S.r.l. to its equivalent in the T.l. when you are translating or finding the translation equivalent. And as I said earlier, that why do we go for these shifts? Not necessarily only level shifts, but category shifts as well. We go for them because of the impossibility of keeping an S.r.l. Item at the same level in the T.l. During the actual translation process. Now, of course, these shifts that are level shifts, they are, what is meant by them is that they are shifts from grammar, for example, to lexis, or vice versa, for instance. In other words, you are translating something that is in grammar in the S.r.l., but you found something that is equivalent, but it is lexical, i.e. a word, not a grammatical structure or grammatical item. These shifts, of course, here's an example of a shift from Russian to English, and this is what actually Catford has used. And he says that imperfective, which is in Russian, that's imperfect and incomplete aspect of tense, with this unmarked item, and the perfective, that's in Russian as well, which is the perfect or the complete action, with its marked term in Russian, as in pisal and pisal. These will be equated to, or has their equivalence in past simple and past and continuous in English, of course. The past simple, we know that it's neutral with its unmarked term, and we have the continuous or the progressive, as some American usage call it, with its marked term in English. So the Russian pisal and pisal, I'm sorry, my Russian is not that good, but this is how they are spelled, is equated to the word wrote, the verb, because we're talking about the verbal aspect here. It is translated as wrote and writing. In other words, it's translated into past, simple past, and past continuous. The Russian aspects are sometimes translatable into these two English aspects, and that is what actually Catford has said in particular. And this example is by Catford in his article which he wrote about translation shifts. Now, there are also shifts that are not really complete ones, cases of incomplete shifts from grammar to lexis. In other words, not fully grammar and it's not fully lexical, the shift. For instance, when you're translating the diacritic item in English grammar, the S.r.l. modifier this or that or whatever diacritic item you use, into the French article plus lexical adjective, le présent. I'm sorry, my French is not pronunciation-wise, it's not very good, but you can see how it's written. Now, in the English, you say this text is intended for, but in the French, you say le présent manuel s'adresse à. Again, apologies for my bad pronunciation, but this example, which has been given by Catford, shows that the word this is translated as le présent or le présent. And that is a shift, but this shift is not a fully grammatical or to lexical, and it's as you can see, the word this is translated the present text instead of this text. These are the level shifts that we have just looked at, which is moving from grammar to lexis, or from lexis to grammar, vice versa. But the other main types of shifts, according to Catford, is called category shift. And of course, in category shifts here, you are talking about a different kind of shifts to the ones we have looked at. The ones we looked at was between moving from grammar to lexis, or from lexis to grammar, for example, which we will come back to in a minute when we are talking about translating some tense aspect to another aspect in another tense, as in imperfect and perfect in the Russian, which is as opposed to in English to the simple present, past, and the past continuous. But now with the Catford, or with Catford's shifts, the second type, which is category shift, there are two types according to Catford under category shifts. The first one is unbound, which is free translation or unbound translation, and the other one is called rank bound translation, i.e. it's not bound by rank. The unbound translation equivalence may occur between sentences, clauses, phrases, words, morphemes even. So that's the kind of unbound equivalence here that you are actually translating. In other words, you are translating a clause with a sentence, or you are translating a phrase with a clause, translating a word into a phrase. That is that's what's called category shifts. Now, of course, in these category shifts, and if we look at them on the slides, let's have a look at the slides, because that helps us quite a lot in following this element here. We find that, of course, as they are of two types, which is unbound and rank bound, the unbound translation equivalence may occur between sentences, clauses, as I said earlier, phrases, words, morphemes, etc. Whereas the rank bound equivalence, translation equivalence, occurs when changing the rank. Rank changing meaning rank changes, unit changes, and these changes can be structure changes or class changes. They're called class shifts, and also unit shifts, which means how many units in English are translated into how many units in Arabic or in French. And there's also what's called intra-system shifts, which is language system change. In other words, you have in English, for example, subject, verb, object, but in Arabic you'll have verb and then subject and then object. In other words, the word order is changing due to the intra-system shifts. Intra means within the same language. In other words, in the English language, there's a system you have to follow, and there is in the Arabic system an internal system which is you have to follow, or if it's in French or in German or whichever language. Now, structure shifts, I can give you an example of structure shifts in grammar, which can occur, of course, because we say structure, that means grammar, that means syntax, or related to syntax. That is when you are translating, for example, an interrogative structure, like a question, into an affirmative one or affirmative structure. In this case, you are translating a question or indirect or direct speech into an indirect speech, for example, as in the case here. He asked, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And then you translate it in the target text into, "He asked about what you are doing tomorrow." So in other words, we have changed the structure here, and we have done a shift here in the structure from an interrogative structure to an affirmative one, a statement similar to a statement one. Of course, there is also what's called a class shift. And the class shift here is when you are translating, changing the class, word class. For example, it's an adjective and you're translating into a verb. Or it's a verb, you're translating into a noun. And these kind of changes in the class, word class, when you are translating the verb into an adjective, that is a class shift. Because you are moving from one class to another, from noun to verb, from verb to adjective, from adjective to adverb, and so on. So you are changing the word class as you are translating. And as I said earlier, that you are doing that only because it's impossible to get it in the same corresponding formal correspondence between the two languages, the source text and the target text. Here are some examples to actually show you some of what I mean about the structure and how it works. Like, for example, a White House in French is translated into une maison blanche. In other words, une maison blanche. And you can see that the modifier white in White House has changed into a qualifier in the target language, which has become after the noun, maison. So blanche came after. That's why it's a qualifying adjective in French, whereas in English, it is a modifying adjective. And that is a kind of shift that's happening. In terms of the intra system, which is that means each, which comes along with other structure and class and unit, the intra system shifts occur internally within the system, within the language systems, whether it's French system or English system. Sometimes the systems are similar in some languages, like for example, in singular and plural in some languages are similar, but perhaps in other languages it might not. But here is an example. The cases in French, le cas, and les cas. You can see the singular and plural are the same. However, frequently you find that it happens that the formal correspondence does not occur. So the singular is translated into plural in French. Like, for example, the word advice in English is translated into des conseillers. And the English, the dishes, which is plural, is translated into French into la vaisselle. Now, in other words, and my apologies for my bad pronunciation in French, you can see that the English is in plural, the dishes, and in French it is singular. And then finally, in English, the word trousers, which is plural, le pantalon, is in French, al-pantalon in Arabic. And sometimes you say S.r.l. There is also some other shifts which are intra-system shifts. I would give you more examples of is the abstract nouns. The abstract nouns in English with their no definite article. In other words, they don't use definite articles for abstract nouns, but their equivalents require definite articles. The word the dignity in Arabic, al-karama, is translated into dignity in English without the. And in French is the same, l'amour, which means love in English without the definite article. Whereas in Arabic, al-hubb. Of course, it's not only al-karama, there are all these various abstract nouns in Arabic which take the definite article, but they don't do in English, like honesty and honesty, for example, as-sidq. It takes a definite article in Arabic but not in English. And glory, al-majd, and so on. So it's quite a lot of these examples of that I'm telling you about, is that they are actually being used where you find the shift, and the shift is to do with the actual intra system of the target language. In other words, in the target language, this is what's happening here. It can happen again with plural and singular sometimes. You can find in Arabic and English, for example. You can say women in English, and you can say al-mar'a in Arabic, the woman, which implies the general superordinate. And also cars in English, which is referring to cars in general, can be translated as sayyara, and which is to refer to the superordinate reference here. So you see in English it is plural, in Arabic it's singular with the different article given to it in order to actually make it sound Arabic.